Good morning and welcome to Qdabra's weekly webinar. My name is Patrick and today we're talking about best practices. Let's do a quick audio check. Don, can you hear me okay?
Hey Patrick, yep.
Hey, great to have you here. Don Lovin is going to be presenting with me today. He's got a couple bonus demos at the end, some really cool stuff that we've been working on. We have quite a lot to cover today. We are talking about the following topics. I want to thank you for joining. We have done these kinds of tips and tricks, best practices before. Today we're focusing on 6 techniques that help forms behave better. The techniques that really make your life easier. Lots of benefits here for you. It's users like faster forms. They like more beautiful forms. We'll talk about these 6 key checks, these techniques that we think are essential to creating great forms. And before we do that, though, we've got some breaking news on SharePoint front. We've got an issue with 365 that we'll talk about briefly. We're going to, once again, do our ad. This will be very short, and then we have the bonus demos, and we have even more bonus, more Lovin at the end. So without any further ado, I'd like to start off here. We've got some breaking news from June 13th. Let me just show you what this looks like. If you're using 365, in fact, we have a quick poll for you. Let's see if I can find the link. The quick poll, I'll run this poll first because I want to kind of get an idea of how many people have might be affected by this. So the quick poll is, are you using 365 or not? And we'll get some quick feedback from you. And while we're doing that, I'm going to actually go to the library where we have this issue. And I'll show you exactly what it looks like. Okay, it looks like about 33% of you are saying you don't use it. 27% are saying you're evaluating, and we have 13% planning, 27% already there. So about 30% of you are using 365. I'm not sure if those of you who are using it have seen this issue, but basically what happened on June 13th is Microsoft actually took out the support for these calculated columns. And as a result, what you end up seeing is the HTML in those columns. So you can see here down in the image below. I'm going to turn off the poll. Thanks for playing the poll. So here you can see in this image below that we've got our site, and in fact on our site you can see that we've got this process graph column which is showing the raw HTML text, which it should not be doing. It should be showing what you see on the right here. And that broke on June 13th. We had several customers complain about it, so we're bringing it to you. There was a silent update. They didn't warn you. They just did it. And we of course care about you, and we fixed the issue. We have this 7-step technique to fix it. What you do is you add a column, a rich text column, and then you add a workflow to copy the values from the old column to the new column. Now you have to change the data type also. Those old calculated columns, which got corrupted, they also got their data types changed, it looks like, from number to text. Most of those should have been number, and now they're text. That's kind of an open question. We're not sure why that happened, but you do need to copy the data from your old columns to the new columns, and then it's very easy to have them work again. And so here you see this very sample site. I'm going to edit one of these items real quick to show you what, and if you want to edit multiple items, what you can do is you can just go into the quick edit mode and just click on quick edit, and you can actually make a change to, let's say, one of these fields here. You can, for example, if you wanted to kick off the workflow, what you would do is you can go into this color column, for example, and you can say, well, I want this to be green. Let me just see if I can do this again here. So you want this to be green, and then you can just copy this down, and if you got a lot of them, then it'll copy down to all of them in the list. Now when we change that value, it's going to kick off the workflow, and in a minute, if we refresh, you should see that the icon on the right here, the color-coded icon, is going to show green for both of those. And sometimes it takes a little bit of time to run the workflow, but it should have changed this. And similarly with the progress here, if we change the progress to say 0.9 and save it, the workflow should kick off in the background and update that progress bar. Like I said, it does take a little bit of time sometimes to run these workflows in SharePoint, as you all know. I'm just going to update this one more time to see if it worked. And it looks like we're still waiting. The green got updated, but it's still, I think we need to wait another 10 seconds or so for the progress graph RT to get updated. And there it is right there. So you can see it, 90% got updated in the bar, and the color-coded icon here on the right got updated as well. So that's the technique, is you're going to create a workflow behind the scenes that copies those values over, and that's a very simple workflow. If you have questions, you can email us at support@qdabra.com. So for those of you who have that problem, we have a fix. Now on to the meat of the discussion today. We're talking about best practices for your forms, but first, just to prevent future update storms from Microsoft, we do have this tool called FormsViewer out there. It's been out there for many years. It offers better performance. Basically, it's a replacement for InfoPath. It works very well in 365. We also have on-prem, and it extends the forms by adding about 50 commands that you need. That obviously, if you want to do things like passing parameters between two forms, or submitting to a SharePoint list, or having something look good on your phone with high DPI screens, you need these extensions. We've got them. It's free. There's a freemium model if you use it a lot. We have to charge a little bit of a usage, but we're a consulting company. We're not in the business of really gouging customers on licenses, for that matter. So we're here to help you, and this is a tool that we think will help you. We probably have several people on the call today. Thank you all for joining. They're using the tool already. Appreciate you being our early adopters. We've had the tool out in production for about a year now, and a lot of great reception. You can click on these links for more details. I'll send the PowerPoint deck at the end. We also have training on best practices and Microsoft Flow and Power Apps coming up in September. So if you want to attend our training, you can go to our Qdabra.com site, and underneath Education, you can register for the upcoming class. And right now we just have that one. Actually, we don't have the class here, so we need to get this updated. But we will be offering training in September, and we'll get that updated quickly. So today we're talking about best practices, and we've got these 6 best practices that we want to talk about. The first one is to make your forms look good on mobile and to use a starter form. And for those of you who have taken our class, we have this module on going from 5 to 50, accelerating your form design process. Instead of spending 2 weeks creating every form, or a week, or whatever it is that you're spending, why not? You have to create lots of forms, so you don't want to have that much time spent on each form. You want to create something that you can start with over and over again that will simplify your life. And we have a starter form. In fact, we're using the starter form on our InfoPath dev site to do a lot of our forms these days in FormsViewer. And what this starter form comes with is a default screen that looks good on mobile. So you can see if you click downloads, and on the right we have FormsViewer, you'll be able to download this FormsViewer starter template. Now it comes with 2 views. Let's just take a look at the form in the designer. And here's the form. So it comes with some instructions, and it's got 2 views here. It's got one for the desktop and one for mobile. Now, on my mobile screen, it looks very similar. There really isn't a big difference between these two. But if you have a high DPI screen, like a Windows Surface device or a phone, this screen here looks a lot better. And it's because behind the scenes we have a CSS that's running, and it's actually going to re-render the form. And we have an example of this coming up with our one of our demos. In fact, I can show it to you right now. I have a policy form. Let's see if I can find where it was. It might be on Chrome. Okay, so I'm going to launch this form. Now, this form is going to open in FormsViewer. So there's a redirect, and then it opens the InfoPath form in FormsViewer. And you can see that this form here is optimized to fill the screen. It's got a responsive UI, which means that the right side of the screen is constantly scrolling back to fit the width of the screen. Now this actual sample doesn't have two different views. It just has the one view for all. But if we look at the sample for the starter form, and this was created with the starter form as well. Let me just show you what the starter form looks like in the mobile version. We've got some screenshots here, and the mobile version is very similar. It basically just wraps, it expands and contracts to fit the size of your mobile screen. So if you have a small screen with a high DPI, it looks really good. So this is the form. This is the starter form. Also has the desktop view, which has slightly different UI. It looks very similar here, but it is different because it doesn't have the expansion like this form has here. So the starter form gives you that built in. You don't need to worry about trying to create a form that's going to look good on mobile. It's built in. The starter form also includes a bunch of other things. It includes, let's see if I can find, where was I here? It includes the optimized views for mobile device. It includes the some validation logic that's built in, and it includes a bunch of other minor things like the header and the footer, and some special fields, so some standard fields that you might use. So here's the starter form again, and you can see in the designer we've got some instructions. You can walk through this. This section is hidden. The form doesn't contain a lot of data sources. It's just some sample fields there that you'll change. So it's relatively reusable. There's nothing really hard-coded in there. There are no data connections to anything that lives on a SharePoint site. These are both secondary data connections. And these secondary data connections just handle the validation in the form along with the mobile support for QRules. QRules actually enables mobile. Now you don't need QRules if you're using this in FormsViewer. So that's the first technique, is using a starter form. The starter form, once again, the problem you have today is it takes time to create a nice looking form, and the technique here is to use this pre-baked starter form that we have. We'll send this along with the download for the training today, the webinar today. The technique is to use responsive design and to build in headers, footers, things that you'll be using over and over again. Ideally, you want to build in centralized rules and other things. We'll talk more about that in a minute. So that's the first of the 6 techniques. Any questions? We do have a question, and we have actually, yeah. So we have questions. You can ask a question or make a comment, and we'll get to those at the end here. We've got quite a few things to walk through today, so I'm going to keep going. The second technique is your data source. Now, with the data source is this thing that appears, if we switch back to our starter form, the fields on your right in the designer, this is your data source. This is the main data source. Secondary data connections are listed underneath data connections. You all know this. But when we're talking about data source, we're really talking about the main data connection here. And this data source for the starter form is very simple, so I'm not going to look at that. I'm going to look at the other one we have. This one would be a good example as well, but we'll talk about that form in a second. So this is an example of another starter form that we have, and this starter form has, as you can see on the right, it has a nice structure. Basically, what you want to do with your data source is you want to make sure you don't have everything hanging off of the main node. So the main node is this root node called InfoPath Starter. In your form, it might be called My Fields. You typically want to rename that group node by double-clicking on it and changing it. It is the root node. It's also a group node. And you, like your file cabinet at home, you want to organize things underneath that based on where they fit logically. So you can see in this starter form, it's a little bit more advanced than the previous starter form. We have the header and the footer. We have a title of the form. We also have HideShow text in the form. And I believe I can show you this quickly in the, well, let's see if I can find it. I'm going to go back to FormsViewer here. We do have this on our main site. Well, let's see. Did Microsoft just take off of our DNS here? Can you guys all still hear me okay? We still have Google. We still have, thanks Don. Looks like I've got a DNS issue. That's really strange. I'm just going to go back to the form for a second, and I'll do this I'll just preview this and show you what it looks like in preview. I'm not sure what's happening with my browser. We'll have to take a look at that in another moment. But to keep the momentum going, let's just take a quick look at this in the preview. So here's the form in preview. You can see that there's the HideShow help there. So it's got that section. It's also got some default buttons. But what I want to draw your attention to are these different tabs. Actually, that's the next technique. This technique that we're talking about right now is this main data source. And for that, really what I wanted to show was that we do have these separate folders we're grouping the data in. So the benefit to you is, number one, you don't want to have everything hanging off the root node because you have to go find things. It's hard to find things. It's easier to browse to a field if you have these folders, right? It's just easier to find it instead of having to scroll through 100 or so fields. In addition, you want to make sure that these fields are well named. So we don't want to have field 1, field 2, field 3, and so on. You want to have your fields well named, and so we recommend starting with the main data source. Before you actually create the forms view, we recommend that you start by adding your fields to the main data source. Now, typically what you're going to do first is you're going to add any secondary data connections you have. Like if you've got to look up to the Get User Profile Service or Active Directory, or you're pulling some list values from a SharePoint list, you'll add those first to your form. And the reason you want to do that is to reduce the amount of duplication in your main data source. So your main data source, you don't want to have the same fields. By adding them to the secondary data source first, it kind of prevents you from adding them again. And then you'll create your main data source, and this is what I'm talking really about with this technique, is you want to create those groups, name your root node correctly, create those groups just like your file cabinet at home for all the fields you're going to be collecting in your form. Now this does require a little bit of pre-planning. You do have to go out and write down, all the fields you're going to be collecting, and of course you won't know all of them at the beginning, but you can get a good structure going by listing out as many as you can. So name your fields, make sure it's consistent. In the example we show here, we're not using lowercase camel casing. We're starting with a capital, but you can see that we have another capital here for a word, like for current value here, where we have a large, a multi-word field. We capitalize the second word so it's easier to read. and that's a good technique. That's called camel casing. Sometimes you'll start off with a lower case, and then you'll have the uppercase where the next word is. But in this case, we start off with uppercase for the first word, and the second word is also uppercase, and that just gives us an easier way to read those fields as we're looking through the main data source. And then we've got so just these other techniques here. You don't want to have everything hanging out the root node. You want to use your group folders to organize things. And one more thing is, for repeating tables and sections, you want them to be within their own group. So you don't want to have a repeating section on its own, like at the level of the main level here. So you can see here that all of these groups at the main level, they're all non-repeating. And the benefit of this is that it reduces ambiguity when you have rules. So if you have a rule that is accessing this field change group and there's something after it, then you may have trouble actually using those rules to pull values out of whatever's after it. And that's because we don't know how many of these intervening repeating field change groups there are. And InfoPath has a hard time determining how many there are. So you always want the repeating groups to be at the end of a non-repeating group. And that way you won't have that problem. Okay, so any questions on 2? That's the second technique, is to basically create a good hygiene for your main data source. The third technique we have is to centralize rules. We've talked about this in the past. The issue you have today are that rules are hard to debug and they're hard to find. You might have multiple buttons with multiple rules on them. The technique that you want to do to reduce that issue is to, well, you can certainly copy rules, and that's a cool technique that InfoPath gives you starting in 2010. You've got this ability to copy the rules. Let me just go back to our starter form. If I have rules on a button, for example, on this Save button, I can actually copy those using these icons at the top here, and that's great. But that then creates a lot of rules throughout my form, and when something changes, then you have to update every single place the rules are. So what we recommend is not to use the copy. Sounds kind of weird, but it's obviously not intuitive, but we suggest using a centralized location for all of your rules. And in this form, we're using a centralized location called form logic. So this is just a secondary data source that has a bunch of different group nodes. One of them is called action, and this has then the submit button on it. So this submit field is being triggered to submit the form by both of these buttons. So both of the buttons will call the same submit field. You can see here the first button, save, just sets the submit equal to save. The second button, submit, equals the submit button equal to submit. And then the actual submit field has logic depending on whether it's a save or a submit. So I think that there's a couple. So this one here, it clears the errors if it's saving, but if it's submitting, it doesn't, because it wants to force the validation. If you're saving it, you don't want to validate your form because you might be getting on a plane or something and you might not have time to go through and fix all the validation issues. So for the saving case, we actually cleared the errors and allowed them to submit the form with the validation errors, because it's not being submitted as submitted, it's actually just being saved, if that makes sense. So that's the technique, and we've talked about this. We have a webinar we've done in the past. Let's just go back and see if our website is still working here. If you click on our webinars page and you look at our past webinars, we did a webinar on centralizing logic. I think it was, we've done a couple of these, but if you search on these, October 9th, 2014, we did one, and I think that's the one that focused primarily on centralizing rules. So you can take a look at that webinar. You can download the samples. We'll also include this starter form with our samples today, along with the PowerPoint deck. That's the third technique. I'm going to go quickly here because we have a lot to cover, and we still have about probably 15, 20, 30 minutes left. We got 3 more techniques to go through, and then we'll have some more demos for some new techniques, pagination, and how to create a form that easily migrates from one site to another. and Don will be doing those demos. But I've got 3 more slides I want to go through. One is to show this HideShow Sections. So we want to use HideShow Sections to reduce the amount of time it takes us to modify our forms. So typically what people do today is they create separate views. And you can see that in this form here, we just have the one main view. And what we're suggesting as a best practice is that you create a form, assuming the form isn't too large. It's a simple form, like 50 to 100 fields. You create one form with one view. Now, why would you want to do that? Well, if you have multiple views, then you have to update every single one of them when your form changes. That can require quite a bit of work. A solution is to have one view that has multiple sections. So instead of having multiple views, you have multiple sections. Now, this doesn't work if you've got a huge view or if you've got more than, say, 100 fields in your form. But for medium-sized forms and below, it works great. And so basically what we're doing here is we're using these tabs to switch between those different sections. And it works really well. If we look at the form in the designer, what we're really doing here is we've got these different sections with these rules. And you see on the right, we've got these hide show rules. So if the current section is, here I want to show you one that has, so this, the tasks one down here, this hides if the current tab is not equal to 2. So this is a good example. We're setting this field current tab based on those buttons on the top. If I click on one of these buttons, they look like tabs, but they're actually buttons. If we click on the second one, it actually sets the current tab equal to 2. Very simple, right? And current tab is just a field in the form. In fact, where is it here? It's probably in the form logic, which would be the best practice. We don't want to store this in the main data source because the main data source doesn't persist the tab that you're on. It opens up and shows you the first tab every time. So indeed it is in the form logic, and we're setting this field equal to the current tab they click on, and we have probably a rule on load that automatically sets it equal to 1. And let's just take a look at that. On load, we have a rule here that says the current user, and it's somewhere in here probably. But that's how we're doing it. We're setting the field based on clicking the button, and the field then controls which views, which sections down below are hidden or displayed. So that's a pretty simple technique. It's very easy to add. You can look at how we did it in the starter form. And the benefit to you is that everything's in one view, so you don't have to worry about updating lots of views. So that's pretty simple. Now let's do a quick poll here. We've got one more poll to run, and that is this poll on, well, I guess I should have probably asked you this at the beginning. Do you have a checklist for your form design process? This basically is, what we're suggesting today is that you use these 6 techniques as your checklist. And it looks like most of you, 40% of you don't have one, and we're still gathering some data here. About 50% of you have voted. So about half of you don't have one, and a third of you do, and some of you are using ours from the training. Thank you very much for doing that. So let's close the poll. So the 5th check, the 5th technique that we want to throw at you today is this idea of workflows. Is today when you're using workflows, what are you using? SharePoint workflows. Some of you who have seen our Microsoft Flow webinars in the last month are using Flow maybe. Flow's great, but for forms you need to basically, you need to surface, when I say surface, you need to display the approve and reject buttons right in the form. One of the problems with SharePoint workflow is to approve something, you have to go into the library, click on the drop down, click approve, and you don't see the text or the data that's associated with that form when you approve it. To approve, to see the data, you have to open up the form and then go back to the library and click on the drop down. And so it's disconnected. And what we're recommending is that you integrate the workflow, the SharePoint workflow, with workflow in your form, and you have buttons to approve and reject. So the example I have today, hopefully it will work, is the approve policy example. Let's just see if our website's back. So this form, which I opened earlier, allows us to create a policy, and we'll just say webinar demos, and we'll just say short and sweet. I think I've done this policy before, and we'll get Dawn to approve it. We're actually going to add the people picker on a 365 site, so we'll look up Dawn's name and we'll add him, and we'll also add my name to 2 approvers for this, and we'll make the expiration today's date. So this is a policy that we're going to send out to everyone on our team. In this case, it's just the 2 webinar presenters today, and if we both vote, then we're good, we're done. So we'll submit this policy. Now when we submit this, you can see that it's done. So we have another library called the policy approval library where the forms are located. So we have this parallel approval process, and the first form is going to send us a link to open up the forms. And let's just take a look at my email and see if I got that. It does run on a SharePoint workflow, so it is usually pretty quick. As you can see, it just sent us this email. And the benefit of this email is that I've got the one-click approval. So one of the things about hybridizing workflows is you want to add these approve reject buttons to email for people that are on the go. They don't necessarily have the ability to log in. You want to give them a one-click approve or reject. And we've covered this in past webinars, but this basically what it does is, if you can see this text here, it actually sets the status equal to approved, and when the form opens, it automatically submits it. So there's nothing else that's required. They just click on approve or reject, and the form's approved or rejected. Now in this case, I actually want to add a comment because I want to show you this technique in the form, which is to add these buttons. And the button is, we're setting it to approve with a comment. So let's see if the form will load. So it says I've approved this policy, obviously. And the key thing here with this approve and reject stuff is that you want to allow the form to automatically communicate with the workflow. And the way you do that is by submitting a value to the SharePoint library that the workflow can use. So if we look at these forms in the designer, and I probably don't have enough time to show you that today, but let's just see if I can get back to where I was with the policy approval here. Let me just talk to it then. So basically what you want to do is you want to have fields in your form for status, assigned to, last modified, and due. And then these fields should be promoted so that they show up as columns in SharePoint. And then the SharePoint workflow can use them. So what you'll do is you'll set the status equal to approved. When they click the approve button, or when they click on the link in email, it automatically saves the form, updating the status. The workflow sees that and sends it to the person for approval. Or the workflow sees that and it sends out email saying you have approved this form. So the workflow is going to be using those fields to send an email. SharePoint workflow is great for doing that, sending email. Also, it's great for moving items, changing permissions, creating tasks. Flow is great for expiration, reminders, and line of business integration for other downstream processes like SQL databases and so on. But you still need to have something in your form that allows you to approve something while you're looking at the data. And for that, you need to create a form that integrates with the SharePoint workflow and flow by promoting those columns. So that's the best practice. Okay, so last but not least, and we do have a question, I think, here. Let me just take a quick look at the question to see. I don't want to get too far. So there's a question from Mark. Mark, thanks for being here today. Can we import the QReal's data connection from the mobile starter form to a more complex form? Yeah, if you just start with the starter form, you have it already baked in, so you don't need to worry about it. And that's the answer there. And then Alan, you've got a question as well. What happens if you have a field on two parts of the same form? Well, that's a great question, and we were talking about that I think earlier when we were looking at the starter form. And if you have a field that you want to name, I think what you mean is you want to name the same thing. So if you got a field like company and you want to add it somewhere else in your form, like say under control info, the way you do that is you just use reference. So there's a reference technique here, and then you can copy it to another section, and you can see that then it shows up, the same name. So I don't know if that was your question, but that's the answer to copying the same field to different sections of your form. Now it's different data, even though you're copying the name, it won't be the same data. Okay, so the last technique I want to show is this performance technique. And really what we want to show here is there's two key things that I want you to think about with performance. One is filtering queries, and the second is consolidating your data connections. So what we see here is I'll show a quick demo of this. We have two forms. One, let's just close this. Okay, so here's our first form. This is actually the good one. So here's the form before we made the changes. So this is a form we did for a customer, and we like demoing this form because it's very complex. And this form actually, we have it published to our local site here, and I think we have links to it. Let me just show you what the links look like here. I'm going to go to Mel's email from last night because I should have copied this into the slide maybe. Okay, so the first example is the form that loads in about 20 seconds or more. And I think that the slide, we're just going to wait for this to load because it's going to take a long time. We've done this demo before, and here comes FormsViewer. So FormsViewer is loading. And really what we're looking at is reducing the amount of data we load when the form opens. So filtering does that. Filtering reduces the amount of query time. So instead of copying all the data in and waiting for this thing to load, what we want to do is we want to only query the data that we need. So filtering is really important, and you can see that the page is still loading. In a second it will come back, but the technique I want to talk about is this filtering. Now how do you filter? So the way you filter is in the slide you can see that on the left we get this information at the beginning. It's querying all of the employee information. And that's bad if you've got thousands of employees because it can take a long time. On the right, we're setting a query field to be equal to the current user. And then what we're doing is we're querying information just for that user. So the benefit here is it just gets that employee information for one user. And that's a lot less information to pull. So did the form finish in the background here? So finally the form opened up. Now let's actually do it with a more with the faster version. So here's the version. Once we've taken and done the filtering, we've also consolidated the the data connections, excuse me. And you can see that it loads much faster. So we've got the form opening in literally seconds versus almost a minute. So how do we do that? Just one second here, I'm going to clear my throat. So the way we did this is we actually, let me just show these forms side by side. We've got another slide on it as well. Actually, that is the main slide. Here's the second slide. On the left, you can see we've got lots of data connections. On the right, we've consolidated them into one config form. And you can see the timing difference between those. In fact, what I just showed you was less than 5 seconds. If we take a look at the forms themselves, this is the form after the changes, and you can see that, actually this is the form before the changes. You can see that we've got, maybe 10 or so data connections, quite a few. And then if we look at the form after we make the changes, same form, it's just got less data connections. We've consolidated them into a config form. Now we've talked about this before. We talked about performance back in March of this year. So I encourage you to go back to that. We'll also include this sample with the webinar kit today, so you can take a look at how we did it. So any questions on the top 6 techniques? Once again, to recap, You want to start with the starter form, make sure your data source is well designed, put your rules in one centralized location like form logic, create one view for those medium-sized forms so that you don't have to update them all the time. Create a workflow that is using both SharePoint and your form to make the experience better for your end users. They can click a button, they can see the data and approve it. They don't have to hunt around for the data and the approval separate locations. And then finally, you want to make sure your form opens quickly. So those are the 6 techniques that we're focusing on today. And we do have a couple bonus demos. In fact, Don, I'm going to make you presenter now. But first, do we have any questions on those 6 techniques? Okay, it doesn't look like we have any questions. So Don, I'm going to make you presenter. I hope you're ready for the bonus demos here. Before we switch over to Don, we've got 2 different problems here that let me set the stage for a second. When you're paginating forms, you can run into problems with repeating tables or with rich text. Why? Because they can run on to the next page and you don't know where to break them. And InfoPath is not smart about that like Word is. So what Don has come up with over the years is a very cool way to optionally insert a section with a page break in it based on what row it is. So it counts the number of rows and it says, well, gee, if you're at the page boundary, put the break in there. And we use the same technique with the rich text. The way we do this is very clever. Don came up with this technique to copy the rich text into a repeating table and thereby using the first technique for both. And so Don's going to show you those 2 techniques quickly. Don, I'm just going to make you a presenter. You're on.
Okay. Can you hear me, Patrick?
Yes.
Okay, great. So, good morning, everyone. So for this first bonus technique that I'll be showing you is the paginating repeating sections. So instead of a repeating table, we've used a repeating section and added a page break section here, which is hidden. As Patrick has said, if it's not the boundary of the page, it's going to be hidden. So if we insert here, say around 50 rows, I've incorporated this form with QRules so that it could automatically insert a number of rows. And I added a calculation logic onto two fields on the table. So let's say if we want to paginate this 50 rows by 5, we're going to get 10 pages, 5 rows for each page. So it's calculating the number of rows initially, and then it decides which page it's going to belong with. So as you can see here, and the page break will only show up if it's the boundary of the next page. Now we can submit this to a library and let DBXL rendering service print it out in a PDF for us. Now this also works if you want to paginate or print it out locally in Filler. So while we're waiting for that, another awesome technique using this approach is that you can just show one section or one page at a time using a pagination logic here. So what I'm doing here is that, okay, let's just wait for that. What I'm doing here is I've got here a current page field. So the table has a hide formatting logic or condition to hide if the page is not equal to 1. So as you can see here, we're paginating the table in the browser, and you can see what page we're at.
You're just using a conditional formatting rule for that, right, Don?
Yeah, that is correct. Now let's move on to the PDF form. So here's how the PDF form looks like, and as you can see here, we are paginating each page with 5 rows. So it proves that the page break is working for DBXL. Now I'm going to show you the form and what's happening in the background quickly. So here you got a repeating section instead of a repeating table, and I added a section here that has a logic which hides it if the preceding or following sibling row page is not equal to the current row page. So if it's greater than the current page, then it's going to be hidden, or I mean it's going to be shown, and if it's equal, it's going to be hidden. Now this is for the current page. This is what I'm using so that you can paginate in the browser. Now it's just a pretty simple, clever technique. And I believe Patrick is going to send a documentation for that. For the next item that we have here, we're paginating a rich text field. So I'm just going to copy in a data from a Word document and click on the trigger field here, or the control, which switches us to the print page. And what you're going to see is that the rich text has been paginated into several pages, and this approach uses an XSLT, which is a pretty clever approach, but it's complex. So I've created a documentation for this. There are 4 sections which you need to update. First is the namespace here, and the page size, which is 15 rows per page, or if you want to increase that, and the XPath to the rich text box. We got 2 places here, and the placeholder, which is the rich text field or a rich text group right here.
So what you're saying, Don, is they don't need to actually understand the XSLT. They can just add it to their form in underneath data resources, and then they can just walk through your document to get the pagination to work, right?
Right, that is correct. So here we have the XSLT, and we just called the command transform, and it did all the work for us. And here's the printing page, how it looks like. So we got a repeating section nested inside a repeating section. So it's transferring the data from this rich text box onto this rich text box, and here we got the page number being calculated in the XSLT. Okay. Lastly, we have the change URL demo.
Just before you show that, Don, I know you're going real quick, and I really appreciate that because people are running out of time here. But you did mention DBXL, and for those of you who don't know what DBXL is, we have a database connector web service that also generates a PDF. It runs on the server, and so when Don submits these, it submits an XML that gets saved to SharePoint, and then SharePoint synchronizes it with this web service that generates a PDF and sends an email. If you're interested in that, please don't hesitate to call us. We're more than happy to show you. We've got a lot of people that use that tool to generate PDFs, and we like it a lot. It's anyway, just want to put that quick clarification in. Thanks, Don.
Thanks, Patrick. I missed out on that one. So we're just waiting for the email. So we got here the paginated rich text box, or rich text data from the SharePoint site. So we've got around 15 rows per page here, and that was the last one, page 4. Okay, oops. So there's a bug right there. We'll need to fix that. Okay, so for the last demo, here we have a form which allows you to submit and query data from the same library. So what we're doing here is we've added an XTP, or we created an XTP, which will allow you to dynamically submit forms and query forms from a library. So if you publish this to a different library, you'll be able to grab or submit data without changing anything in the data connections or the forms logic. So here we have a bunch of data. So what I'm doing is I'll be selecting one and I'll update it. So let's change the company to, let's say, McDonald's, and submit it. So we're submitting to a library. Oops, it looks like, I'm sorry about that. It created another one since we're using the form name for the company. So that shows that it's submitting to that library. And what we're going to do next is check the library out just to verify if it's there. And then we're going to publish the same form onto a different library. So here we have it submitted. Okay, so I'll go grab that form, which is already opened up here, and I'll publish this to a SharePoint 2013 library, which doesn't use FormsViewer. So I'll just do this quickly. Okay.
And while you're doing that, just for those of you who are still trying to figure out what this technique is all about, this is really key when you're trying to migrate from one site to another. Now, if you change the server the server name in your URL, you publish from, let's say, Qdabra.sharepoint.com to someplace like training2013.formsboard, those server URLs are going to change, and InfoPath Designer is going to prompt you at the end of the publish wizard and ask if you want to fix up those URLs, those data connections. If you choose yes, then it'll automatically modify them correctly, which is really a clever technique. But it doesn't work very well when you're on the same server and you're moving things. So there's the dialogue that you normally get. So Don, you're going to ignore that, right?
Yeah, just to prove that the logic works, okay, I'm going to click on publish, and I did not check this adjust data connections automatically. So we're just waiting.
The form is actually published with the bad data connections, but somehow it's going to work because of something in the form, right?
Right, that's correct.
And what is it in the form that you've got? You've got some onload logic that is going to figure out where the form was published to and automatically fix the data connections behind the scenes. Is that right?
Yes, that is correct. Here we have a, actually we're using a change URL XCP template, and it's going to add this section here, which is going to grab the library URL, name, GUID, and host URL on form load. And once it does that, it's going to do this, it's going to perform it every time it loads, but it will only change the submit connection and the query connection, since it has logic here or condition not to trigger if it's already populated. So all you need to do here is specify the name of the query library. So this has to be equal to the data from, or the name of the query data connection that you have. Same with the submit library. So I use this one here, and that's this one. That's all you need to populate, and then a bunch of rules here to set the trigger. Oh, where is that? To set the trigger here to the command node. And then let's now go to the library where I published it. So you don't even have to specify the name of the library. It automatically does that for you. So I created here this new library. And as you can see, there's no data yet. Now if we open this up in the browser, so there's no, let's just verify that there's no data. Okay, there's none, and I'll create a new one. Let's say Nike Don Madden email don@gmail.com. Okay, I'll just fill this out real quickly and then submit this data to the library. Now when it's done, it's going to clear out the fields, and there we go. So we have it queried from the same library. Just to verify that, I'll just close this form, and here you can see it did its job.
That's awesome, Don. Yeah, so for those of you, I'm just going to quickly, thank you, Don, awesome demos. I'm going to quickly switch back. We're out of time, so I'm going to quickly wrap this up. Just hopefully you can see my screen again. So what Don showed is these two techniques for pagination. Essentially, they're using the same technique, but repeating tables can be paginated using page numbers and page size. Rich text can be mapped to a repeating table to do the same thing. And then the last thing that Don showed was this very clever form, and you can actually take the XML template part that he created and you can add it to your form and follow those instructions that you saw, and it automatically will fix up the form on load to query and submit to the library where it was published. And then of course you can specify other queries that you want to be fixed up using the technique that he mentioned. So that's it for today. I really appreciate everyone's patience. I know it's been a long session today. We've had about an hour or so. If you've got questions, now's the time to ask them. We've had a couple questions for earlier in the webinar. Any other questions for us? And appreciate everyone taking this time out of your day. We have 3 upcoming webinars for you. Next week, after our Independence Day in the United States, we're going to be switching our gears from Microsoft Flow to Power Apps. So we're going to show you a demonstration of Power Apps, basically learn the basics of 101 webinar on Power Apps, what they are. We've done this before, but we're going to do it again. It has been about a year since we looked at Power Apps, so we're going to update you on the latest and greatest Power App technology out there from Microsoft. And then a week later, on 7/13, we're going to talk about FormsViewer. We have a new release coming out with some designer options, mainly for creating mappings to lists and sublibraries. We're continuing to make a lot of progress on FormsViewer, so we'll have an update for you. This will be a short webinar. And then a week later on the 20th, we'll have a deeper dive into Power Apps with Hillary Stupa, and she'll be talking about data connections. The first Power Apps webinar will be with Jen Lindsay, so you'll have a much more mellifluous voice, to guide you through the basics there, rather than my raspy, cold voice. I've had a cold the last couple days. I apologize for that. Thank you, Alan, for making that comment. And appreciate, like I said, everyone's patience with the webinar today. We had a lot to show you, and hopefully some of it resonated. Hope you all have a wonderful day. Talk to you next week.